Well, welcome, Kirk Boyd. It is great to be with you. Haven't seen you in some time. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good, Rob. It's an exciting day. But without, here we are. It's inauguration day, so I can't help but say something. But I
Yeah.
do think systemically, it's time for us to all get along about certain basic principles like peaceful transitions of power, whichever direction they're going.
Well, it does feel like an important day for an important conversation. So I'm
Yeah.
appreciative of you making time. For those of you who don't know, I'm Rob McClellan. I'm a pastor at Westminster Presbyterian Church here in Tiburon. Uh, and it's through that community that I've had the honor and privilege of getting to know Kirk a little bit. And so we're here today to talk about his life's work, his passion. And rather than me summarize it, I'm going to let him share with you about that. And we're just going to have a conversation for a while about that and what it's meant to his life and what he cares about in this world. So with that, let's begin. Kirk, you have in many ways given your life to the cause for an international Bill of Rights, a global Bill of Rights. Where does that come from in you? I guess another way of asking that would be,
Yeah.
if I could go back in time and meet the younger Kirk Boyd, where would I have...
Much younger even. Yeah.
I didn't want to say it that way. Where would I find...
I don't mind. Every year's a blessing.
Where would I find the genesis of this work in your life? Where does this come from in you?
Well, I've always been very active in civil rights. I think because some of that age you're referring to, I go all the way back to the Vietnam era when I was in Palo Alto, or actually it was Menlo Park at the time, and during the Vietnam War, and I was working in a grocery store, and there was a guy, a Stanford student who I worked with, and I was boxing and doing shelves. And he was called to go to war, to go to Vietnam. And there was a big commotion within the store about whether or not he should go. It was very political times. Some people thought he should, and he decided to go. And he wasn't there for more than 3 weeks before he stepped on a landmine. And he was blown apart from that and killed. And I was only 10, but I was really at the time, I was moved by that. So I wouldn't say there was one catalytic moment, but since you asked me to think back, that's certainly one of them. And then jumping forward, that I went on and with civil rights and through law school and that sort of thing, I always had that focus. And then later in my practice, I wasn't content with just making the most out of the rights that we have. I always would like to see the rights expanding so that we have them more available to people.
Was it a sense that 10-year-old sense, or as you got older, that something was just deeply not right, or was it you saw the potential of how things could be if they were made more right?
I think it's a combination of those two things. I think that if we really look carefully, we can see how the unfairness in society, and we can also see if you have the legal training, you don't even need legal training really, but you can see you need process. You need to have systems in order to protect people's rights and to create the social order. And for me too, that a religious piece of this is I can remember back in 1990, I was in Hawaii and I was practicing law there. And I went and I was really wondering what to do. And I went to a Presbyterian church and I was praying for some guidance. And there was a pastor there, his name was Pastor Owens. And he was, I think, a visiting pastor from Tennessee or something. But it turned out that day, Rob, was December 10, which is International Human Rights Day. And it just, I remember being really, people talk about whether they have some moment, some epiphany or something. I don't know, but I was struck somewhat by him and somewhat by the timing and the answer that I was given about my calling. And I've been pursuing international human rights ever since.
And you mentioned systems and structures and why they're so important. Why that avenue? Why is that the vehicle that for you makes sense to achieve this what I would call sacred work?
Yeah, because I think that it's two pieces. So when I'm there in church with you and listening to a sermon, there are definitely times where I'm reading in the Gospels. There are times when I feel stirred to understand that for me, God's message, Jesus' message, is for all people, not just for our congregation, but for everyone on this planet. And so once you have that sense that in order to make that happen, then you need the second step. And I find so many people get stuck on the first step thinking it's enough. Oh, I'm aware of this now. But really, unless you change the processes, and this is why I like the Eleanor Roosevelt's work on an international Bill of Rights. And so she was a very religious person, strong Christian, but she wanted that second element. She wanted to actually create the world as it might be, to make it so.
So how then do you convince people of the importance of that second step when we live in a culture that loves to bask in the first step? Meaning, we live in a pretty anti-institutional time. We're cynical about our institutions. We think they're stuffy. We're rugged individualists. Now, maybe we're arriving at a cultural moment where we're again recognizing the importance of our institutions in holding the fabric of our society together.
Yeah.
One might hope. But
Yeah.
how do you make that hard sell in this day and age that the institutions are critical in achieving the things that people want and need?
Yeah. One, I think there's a shift afoot somewhat from a self-centered view to an other-centered view, just because I was reading this on Martin Luther King Day in one of his speeches, right? So I know there's fluctuation, but I like to think that's what the moral arc is doing over time. And then the hard part, to get people to actually do something, that's why I like Eleanor Roosevelt so much. And that's why we have this nonprofit, this Eleanor Lives, and so much of my study has been dedicated to the actually having rights enforceable in court. Just because, to me, and I don't think you can get a large swath of people. Well, it depends on how you think of it percentage-wise. 1% of humanity is still 70 million people. Okay, so that's still a large swath. But I do believe that 1% is enough. It's about pooling more than anything, finding the people that are willing to go to that second step and act. And we can talk more about this, but to take some act.
Well, let's back up then. Talk about why Eleanor, and that's your organization. I mean, this iteration of the organization is Eleanor Lives, right? So
Right.
Why Eleanor? What was her vision? Talk about her work for those who may not be as familiar about it as you are, and then your vision for the organization right now.
Sure. I think the main thing is that with Eleanor, I'd say it wasn't just a vision, but a plan.
Aha.
So really, it's a plan for humanity. And when people go to our website for Eleanor Lives, they'll see that that's the subtext under there is plan for humanity, because she actually was a planner and she wanted to build a movement. That's why her biography, a new biography's just come out, and others have talked about the fact that she was building a movement. So when we say why her, it's because she had an actual plan and a movement to get people to support creating enforceable rights. So there was something that everyone could participate in creating a social order that they would then live under.
And what were the obstacles that she ran into and that work ran into?
Yeah.
In other words, why is it still necessary today?
Right. And many of those obstacles still exist today. And so it's a question of just wearing them down over time. I'm trying to think, well, how was it that you put in a sermon one time? It's wearing thin the line between earth and heaven.
Yeah, it's a very
right?
Celtic notion of what we call thin places. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's always stuck with me. And it just spontaneously came into my head again that's it. It's about wearing it thin and because she wanted to take, because despotism, look, what we've just gone through is that humans have been created for whatever reason, right? With this, that part of us is very ape-like, right? And that it's hierarchical. And with gorillas, you couldn't convince them that you were going to write something up that was going to make the rules for the type A gorillas. It's always going to be hierarchical. But for whatever reason, God, maybe 10,000 years ago, gave us this ability to make this transition to where we could read and write. And that's what separates us from all other species and creatures on the planet. We alone have that capability. So we can actually create this system where for all of us, the humble and the gentle, and the meek, however you want to put it, can write the rules for those who govern. And it's an exciting prospect.
So how do words on a paper then create freedom? Because you'll hear people in the service of what they would call freedom advocate for as few rules as possible, because that's how they understand freedom. But how might you characterize it a little differently?
Rules are needed if you want to be free. And to give you an example, for free speech, if I want to go and engage in my free speech, if there's a majority of people who don't want to hear me, unless there are rules that will protect me, then I'm not going to be able to have those rights or those freedoms. And the same, Rob, applies to the economic rights, like healthcare. If I'm going to be driven into bankruptcy because I have cancer, or there's some 12-year-old girl with a tumor who can't have it taken out because she doesn't have the money, right? Or she's going to go broke, or has to have a Kickstarter campaign, or all these things, then the rules aren't right.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up economics. Right before we began, we were just chatting about Martin Luther King having the holiday just passed. And we were remarking how, well, even at the time, he may have been opposed all along the way. Certainly near the end, what got him into real trouble was to raise questions about the war and raise economic questions. Why is it that when someone questions the way economics work in our society, they get into trouble? What's so sacred about that for us?
I don't know, Rob, and I find it really incompatible with the teachings of Jesus. So I think it's particularly hard for Christians to have this disconnect between being extremely well off and supporting a stratified community and following these teachings. I'm not saying it has to be totally egalitarian. That's not it. Meritocracy can exist within well-being.
Yeah.
And so that's really, I think that part of the problem is that it's not presented in a way that gives people the assurance that well-being for one is well-being for all. And so we kind of all, if you're asking a very hard question, but I think we all have our fears about that there won't be enough to go around.
Yeah.
When in fact, we can. There is enough. I had a great professor one time who came into the classroom, and he said, look, and I've been a professor too, so I understand this point. He said, you can't leave that many things in your mind to take with you over the years ahead, but remember this one. And he said, there is enough to go around.
Interesting. I've had that. I could recount that word for word lesson in seminary. I mean, really, one of the theological concepts you talk a lot about is abundance, a theology of abundance versus a theology of scarcity. And similarly, when you say well-being, that becomes used as a synonym for salvation, right?
Yeah.
In the Western contemporary Christian world, we've turned
Huh.
salvation into an individual ticket out
Yeah.
into heaven.
Yeah.
But the biblical witness is
Yeah.
far more about an invitation for heaven to set up residence on earth. And the gospel message, as well as the prophetic tradition in what we would call the Old Testament, is profoundly about wealth distribution.
Yeah.
And being a worker and having access to food and security, even the teachings that get reduced to sort of personal moralities, divorce, for example, which really terrified Christians in this country for a while, is really about protecting the well-being of somebody who's vulnerable, who was in a marriage was protected economically by her family, and then if she's divorced, she's totally vulnerable. I think that's actually what Jesus was talking about. Well, this isn't about me, but my point is, I mean, I think spirituality is really about these very same issues, but as you alluded to, we get the same kind of resistance. Because certain understandings of economics in this culture are deemed as sacred. Yeah. And even when our sacred systems draw those into question, that's when the walls go up.
Yeah.
How do you work around those walls? So if it's about rubbing the veil thin between heaven and earth, there are things that are reinforcing the boundaries. And putting over, pasting back over the holes. How do you work through and around those areas?
I call it pooling.
Say more.
And that it's a matter of finding the people who already have some consciousness, whether it's through the religious teachings or it's just through whatever, the yoga or whatever the path, so that they're already aware of an other-centered approach to life. But nothing's being offered to them to focus on together. And this is really why at Eleanor Lives, when people go to the website, I hope they will, because when all these breakthroughs are being made in all these other fields in medicine and physics and the rest, there's no reason why we shouldn't have it in law too, right? People get together and think about what rights we should all have. But on there's a spinning globe. And when people put in their name and their country, then wherever they are on that globe, a spark of light goes off. And we call this our Lights for Rights campaign. And so with the pooling, the idea is to find the people who have some consciousness. And I do think it's very widespread. But no one's offering up something that they can focus on together. And this is what Eleanor was particularly good at, is that she was a movement maker.
So you're trying to create some pooling by bringing these people together, giving them focus around a Bill of Rights. Are you advocating, are the 13 rights you want posted there? Or what is it you're advocating or inviting people to join in a movement for?
Okay, first of all is to just get the focus together, right? And it's not just the people. So there are white lights and then there are green lights for nonprofit organizations. And there are blue lights because there are a lot of businesses that also want to see rights and well-being for all people. There are great people throughout businesses. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is that yes, we do have a draft document. It went version 13 now. It went for each year. So it's been 13 years. We're about to come out with our new booklet for Eleanor Lives. And it's just been sent off to the typesetter. So we're in that point where we are looking for support. If anybody wants to help put together a booklet, that's great. But the beauty of the booklet is that it's not only is it a tangible thing, but it's online so that anybody who wants to actually talk about, we have a draft, even after 13 versions, we have a document that we're still taking input. So everyone can, whether it's students in schools or it's people in businesses, or professors at universities. Everybody can contribute their thinking. So it's those two things: focus or lights and suggestions.
Yeah, and even as I've heard you speak about it in the past, that part of what you're inviting people to do is simply join in making the shared statement. We think there ought to be a Bill of Rights, that should be universal, that should be shared, it should be global. And it's not even about yet fighting out what they need to be, but just let's agree on the notion as a focal point and then build it together. Is that a fair characterization?
That's absolute. And here's I'll use a quote from Martin Luther King. This is one I was just reading on the holiday, where he says, and this is in his speech, American Dream, right? So people think of it as being all about America, but the truth is his vision was much broader than that, you know, having spent that time with Gandhi and from his own religious studies and thinking. So this is what he said, Rob. He said, quote, "If we want to achieve the American dream, we must have a world perspective." Okay. So that's really what it comes down to. And even for the people that are kind enough to listen to you and me have this conversation, which is a delight. I'm just glad to talk with you. If others want to enjoy this, that's fine. And they can have similar conversations with us in this process.
Absolutely.
But that's the thing, is to have that perspective.
Well,
That's what you share. When I'm there in church and I'm listening, or if I'm listening to a video,
these days.
Look, that perspective, you've always opened up a broader perspective, which I think is really fitting for God's and Jesus' teachings, and also for what we need to do.
Well, what you mentioned about King, America essentially cannot fulfill its dream if the world doesn't.
Right.
It's the same as there, one is not well if we are not well. I mean, it's the same concept, just scaled up, so to speak. A moment ago, you said something interesting that I think it's worth exploring, or at least highlighting. It's very easy as a preacher, for example, or as maybe a public figure, to attack some group or individual. Corporate America, they're the problem. I can make them the scapegoat and the enemy. And there are plenty of examples that would support that position. Government, for some or other political party within government, is the problem. Different individuals are problematic. But what you lay out is an invitation for partnerships across those areas, meaning it's got to be business, civil society, government, individuals together, that it's not about finding the right sector, but the right people within those sectors to come together. Can you talk about that a little bit more, or point to instances of success there? Because I do think we often cut off potential partners before we ever have a chance to discover them.
It's true, and also we cut off potential minds. I think one of the important things is to capture the young minds. If the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it says right there in the preamble that it shall be taught in all the schools. And in California, for example, it's in our education code that the students are required to be taught about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Wow. And yet when I teach at Berkeley, and these are outstanding students, and I typically don't take more than 60 because I like to be able to get to know all of them. I always ask the same question on the first day. How many of you have been taught about the Universal Declaration? What do you think the number is out of 60?
Oh, I don't even want to guess. 15.
No, it's more like 5 or 6, Rob.
Oh.
And it's just, and so we're missing, we're not teaching about those values in a shared perspective and that kind of an outlook. And so we find ourselves in a situation like this with America First and get what you can, and it's all about us, or it's all about me, and it just doesn't serve us.
Well, that's the great irony, isn't it? It doesn't even achieve the goal that it states.
Right. No.
Yeah. that
It's
there's
more
there's
expensive to have now, a big claim to success is, oh, now we created a whole new branch of military government, the Space Force. Rob, it was lost on people. Once you create a military branch, you can't stop it. And so now we're militarizing space. It's like, I wish everyone would just try and look through God's eyes.
Yeah.
Just try. I'm not claiming that I do, or I can. Don't, please, I hope no one thinks that I'm, making that kind of a claim. I'm just saying we should try.
Yeah. Well, that is the quest, right? We used to say it's to see God in everyone or Jesus in everyone. But folks like Richard Rohr would say, well, it's not just that. It's seeing everyone as Christ in the manner in which Christ would.
Yeah.
So you talk about teaching it in school. I do actually remember it in school.
Oh.
I really do. Now,
wow.
I wouldn't be able to say much about it, but it was definitely in our curriculum.
Huh. In high school?
What's that?
In high school?
You
talking about seminary?
Where.
You sure it wasn't
No,
seminary?
No. It was growing up. It was certainly pre-college. Absolutely. Great state of Indiana, the Midwest, the heartland.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
But okay, so my son is 8, younger than one would encounter that in school. How would you explain to him the importance of something like this?
I would say that I would start talking about, well, do you think there are some things that everyone shares? Like, should there be slavery anywhere? Okay. Wow. And so and a lot of people, whatever the age, when they come to that understanding that, okay, we should never have slavery. Then you can start to ask, well, what about girls? Should boys and girls be treated the same? Should it be fair between them? And that's what I actually think that, and we have someone, she's on our board, she's our education director for our project. Her name's Missy Laren, and she's just finishing up her doctorate now. And she's putting together a curriculum for Earth Day, in which they teach about rights, but since we include rights in the International Bill of Rights, it's part of it. But she's trying to create the consciousness even at the middle school level. So I would say for your son, he might be 2 years away from the point where you could start, and then and it's a society, you start to share it, because it's all about, it's about story, Rob.
Yeah. Oh, I'm getting
story. We're storytellers.
Well, we are, and I'm getting chills because I wasn't sure what you're going to do with that question. But he started this year reading these books. They're called I Am books, and they're ways of introducing kids to sort of historical figures, Martin Luther King, Frederick Douglass, and a couple, and you can see
Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yeah, well, you can see him light up around those very questions. So they'll ask about integration of sports or some slavery thing, and he will respond exactly as you led him to in that question. But wait a minute, how could that be that there were slaves? I mean, you can see it not connect in his little mind, and the sense of justice is there. I mean, it's already in him. Yeah. One of them is about Billie Jean King and how her, that famed tennis game where she threw some of our gender assumptions into question. Yeah. And for him, it's like, well, of course girls are as blank. So, I actually think the way you say it is so fitting. Shouldn't we be able to share? Should we have slaves? Should girls be relegated to this or that? I mean, these questions are alive in us at a very young age.
Yeah.
And don't we live in a moment where our young people are not waiting any longer for us to do it? Whether it's those kids that had to grow up way too fast at Parkland, and then decided to turn their pain into public action. Whether it's climate
Yeah.
and Greta and all the other indigenous
Yeah.
people have been doing this for much longer. Whether it's the youth poet laureate from the inauguration today.
Oh, I am Amanda. What is it? What's it? Amanda?
I confess I didn't know her name till today, and I fear to
She is.
misquote it.
So I'm going to join her fan club. Jordan, is it?
I
Anyway.
want to say Jordan or Gordon. I'm embarrassed. I can't
Gordon.
quote
I think
it
it is Gordon. I think it's Amanda Gordon, and I'm embarrassed that I didn't. But I'm going to. I assure you, it will become. I'm in her fan club. That was astounding. It gave me such hope for our youth and our. She just represented an entire global generation, as far as I was concerned.
Yeah, it does feel like, well, there's a piece of me that grieves that our young people have to recognize pain on a global level and threat on a global level, because I feel like they shouldn't have to, but they do, and they have, and they're doing something with it that's productive, and that is enormously inspiring to me, and I think to many.
Rob, the real powerful thing is going to be when they transcend the divisiveness that exists between these nations. Again, taking that view from God's eyes, right? Looking at Earth. And the astronauts, they say this. They say you look down and they say the first you look for the lines. Because the Earth, when you're near Earth orbit, the Earth is spinning beneath you like a globe. And so they say the first thing they do is they look for the lines. And by the third day, they don't see him anymore, Rob.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Well, we may have started to answer this next question then. I've got a couple more for you. Your website is eleanorlives.org. Does Eleanor live, and where? Where do you see her alive today?
I see her alive in all the people that have been touched by her in so many ways. It's we just have gotten 62 new volunteers to Eleanor Lives, all of them lawyers from all over the country who have come to us because they want to work on an international Bill of Rights. And it's overwhelming. We've got an executive director and he does some, and we've got another editor and he's been doing some, but I do most of we follow up with a Zoom to find out how to connect with these people. And I've done the majority of them. And the thread is this connection to Eleanor, that they've all been touched by her, Rob, in some way. Either they have a relative who loved her and talked about her, or maybe they got something. I had some woman from Maine who collected her memorabilia and had all these letters from her and stuff like that. So she has left a lasting, with the My Day column, she was the original blogger, she wrote her column 5 days a week for 26 years.
Oh my goodness, I didn't know that.
I can't imagine. In the midst of everything else she was doing, she cranked out a column every day.
Wow.
Yeah. She touched a lot of people, and I think that's really the power behind it. And that's why I'm just thrilled with what we're doing, because it rests on her shoulders and not on ours.
People have made the comparison of this time in our country to the time when Roosevelt took over. If that's so, I wonder if this is a time that's ripe not just for his work, but for hers again. Do you see parallels between that time in our history, our global history, in the time right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So much so that in our new version that's about to come out, it's version 13, we have a section in there with the title, Looking Back to See Our Way Forward.
Wow.
Just because I think that the connection, I'm really glad you asked this question. I think the connection is so close that it's very worthwhile to look back. The infrastructure, for example, I would love it if Biden were to step up and say, we're going to rebuild this country together, and we're going to do these infrastructure improvements right through all those red states, blue states. We're going to put everyone to work.
Yeah.
Right? And I would love to see that kind of a message. And with Eleanor, look, with the racial division in this country, and I think that she managed to cross divides. She really did. And so I think there's good reason to look back at Eleanor at the same time and have the guidance.
Well, that's it. That is, if there is ever a need for people who can transcend those lines that have been drawn, it's now. So
and I think there's a yearning for it too. I think that there really is and fortunately, I think the younger generations feel a lot of that.
You know,
I have to give them an avenue.
I hope you're right, and I think you are right. In one of the, church is one of the few places, although it's going through the same kind of stratifications and divisions that other places in our culture are, but it is still one of the places where you have people who come together who differ politically or ideologically.
Yeah.
And while that presents some tension sometimes, one of the things it does also provide is it allows you to glimpse the shared yearning you have with someone that you're quite different from.
Right.
So I think you're right on that. Okay, so somebody
on that sitting in the sermons with you on Sundays.
I thought you agreed with me all the time, Kirk.
No. But when it comes to the perspective, yeah,
absolutely. What's the point if we're just going to be an echo chamber?
And it's actually, I think we all benefit if we can learn that there shouldn't be an expectation that we have to agree all the time.
Right.
And some of the times it's that crucible of disagreement that leads to a better result.
Absolutely. In certain parts of our culture, I will own white culture, for example, upper middle class, upper class white culture, church culture, sees conflict as a sign of that something's broken, rather than as a potentially creative act.
Yeah.
And so we avoid those kinds of things that might make us better for the sake of a momentary comfort, but maybe long-term dysfunction or malaise.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I think that's part of you're asking about why people don't act. Sometimes that's why they don't act, because they feel some discomfort. I know a lot of people will look at that spinning globe, but they won't become a light. And for the life of me, I can't understand why. Who isn't going to support the idea of rights for all people?
Yeah.
We're not even asking people to become a light to support a particular document, although we have a good draft.
Yeah.
We're just asking them to support the idea that, hey, let's figure out some rights. We can start with slavery, right?
Yeah.
And then kind of go from there. And they get stuck, Rob. They get that's so intriguing to me. They get stuck because they just feel that there'll be some disagreement in this process.
Yeah.
And we need to feel more comfortable. People need to feel more comfortable.
Tell people how they can get involved then. Somebody stumbles across this conversation, they find you somewhere else. They say, hey, I want to learn more. I want to know more. I want to engage. What do they do?
They just remember the name Eleanor. Okay, and then go to Eleanor Lives. They just type in Eleanor Lives on the web, and they'll see that spinning globe. And this is seriously less than a minute. If they can see the globe, of course they can spend some time reading things, and if they like the idea of everyone focusing together, all you do is put in your name and your country, and that spark of light goes off on the globe wherever you are. And that's our goal is to have 100,000 lights. We just started this. We started in the heart of the first wave of the pandemic on March 8th, 2020, which was International Women's Day.
Wow.
And then to go through and get enough together to be able to build the website and all the rest of it. And thank you for being a light.
Oh,
and they can see on the right, we have a right-hand column now where we have musicians and artists and all sorts of different people and different groups that we are asking to become lights too. Because one of the things, it's interesting, and because I knew we were going to be talking, so one of the things I was looking at from King was his comments about the churches. You know, King made comments about the church.
Sure did.
And he wasn't afraid to be critical. So he said, you know, he said, it's a sad thing that in the churches, the people tend to be more tail lights than headlights.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. You know, there was a movement at some point, as I understand it, to get Letter from a Birmingham Jail put into the biblical canon. And what a statement that would be for, like Paul, he called the church to account, to live up to the principles it claims it is created in the image of.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
Headlights,
not in
not
a
taillights.
self-righteous way. I'm certainly, I'm not saying that, I'm any better than anyone else within the church. And I don't feel that at all. What I do feel, though, is that we can all follow his headlight. I'm glad I can be a taillight. That's okay. But let's look at some of these people who really shown some light on some things for us.
Yeah, amen to that. Well, as Kirk mentioned, I'm a light, and I encourage you to check it out and prayerfully consider becoming one yourself. And Kirk, I want to thank you for your time and your work, and let's do this again sometime.
No, I think it's just ongoing. It's ongoing, Rob.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
That sounds good. All right. Take care.
Okay.